Hey guys, it's Kevin, and this is my review for Better Call Saul, Season 1, Episode 650, and this episode was huge, wow, this episode was by far the best episode of the season, and the thing was, this episode didn't even focus on Jimmy, it didn't focus on him, it took all the focus away from Jimmy's storyline, and focused on Mike, and that, it was the best episode of the season, I have to say, and this episode just... It honestly kind of made me feel like we should just make this whole show about Mike because, honestly, his story is so tragic, and apparently a lot of people are saying for Breaking Bad fans, this is the episode to come into. Like, if they haven't seen Better Call Saul yet, this is the episode they should come into, because apparently we never really knew anything about Mike's past, and he was a very mysterious character, and finally we learned something. And if Jonathan Banks better get an Emmy nomination after this episode for Best Supporting Actor, because he did a fantastic job in this episode. He was amazing, and he killed it. He did a fantastic job. So let's just get to it. As we know, basically, at the end of last week's episode, something happened. We don't know what exactly happened, but he was questioned by police, and there's a train headed down the tracks, and it pulls into a station, and Mike gets off the train. He goes into the depot and sits down, and Stacey calls to him, and he thanks her for coming, and she hugs him, and she says she's parked across the street, and he says he needs to go to the bathroom, and she says she'll meet him out front, and he goes into the woman's room instead of the men's and calls out that he's the janitor. He puts a quarter in the feminine supplies machine and gets a pad. So he heads up into the stall, pulls off his shirt. We see a gunshot wound, and he pulls the bandage off. He uses the sanitary napkin to bandage it. He goes back outside to meet his ride, and later Mike pushes his granddaughter on the swing, and that was a very interesting way to start the episode. So Mike pushes his daughter on the swing, and he tells Stacey that she's a good kid, and she asks how he likes it out west, and he says there's a lot of wide open spaces. She says she's doing okay and is adjusting, and he asks how Kaylee is doing. Now, Kaylee is his granddaughter, and she says he still asks about her dad and misses him, and Stacey asks how long Mike is in town. He says he's there for good. He says he's back solid and isn't like he is. He says he wants to be there for her and Kaylee, and Stacey says she's glad he's better, but says she has to ask about how before Matty died. He was different, and he asks how. She says he was moody and barely ate, wasn't sleeping, snapped at her, so... You can see there's a lot going on with the two of them in this episode, basically. You can definitely see that. And I have to say, as I said, I really do love this episode focuses mainly on Mike and Stacey. Now, Stacey is, of course, his daughter-in-law, and I thought it was really good that he met these two characters because they didn't really know too much about Mike, and he's finally reconnecting with them, and this whole episode's about reconnecting with people, and just... us catching up. I mean, they're finding out as much of Mike as we do in this episode, so I really do love that. So basically, he says he's there for good. He says he's back solid and isn't like he is. And basically, he asks how. She says he was moody and barely ate and wasn't sleeping and snapped at her. She says she thought something was up at work or that he was sick. And Mike says cops aren't real touchy-feely. And Stacey says it was more than the usual tough guy crap and asks if he noticed. And Mike says he seemed okay to him. She says she didn't know what to think. Then 3 or 4 days before he died, there was a phone call. And he was talking at 3 or 4 a.m. She says she listened and he got intense and was whispering, screaming. She says he didn't get worked up, but he was really mad about something. And Mike asks what he said, and Stacey says she couldn't really hear it, but called him out on the next morning. But he wouldn't talk to her, and she says she thinks Matty was talking to him. And Mike's like, me? You were talking to me? And Matty knew he could call Mike anytime there was a problem. She says she thinks it was him, and Mike says he can't recall any late night heart-to-heart with Matty, and says maybe it was a CI. He says he knows she's doing a what-if thinking, and he says she can't beat herself up like this. And Mike says Matty's gone, and that's all there is to it. And Stacey says he has to feed Kaylee and put her in bed, and Mike says he can always drop by and keep an eye on her, and he says he wants to help, and he leaves, and Stacey says she'll see him around. He waits out front for a cab, and Francisco picks him up, and Mike asks how well he knows the town, and he takes Mike to a vet to get sewn up, and the vet tells Mike to take it easy and says to get a sling, and he asks if the vet has one, and he says he has a cone. He gives the guy $500, says we know he did get hurt, and he's covering up his wound still. We don't know why, we just know that he got hurt, and he's covering it up, but again, we don't really know why he's covering this whole thing thing up, and I thought it was interesting that we actually didn't know why he was covering up this wound. It made the story more interesting, and it made me more invested in it, because that's another thing that this episode does, is it doesn't tell you too much, but it tells you a lot. We find out a lot about his character in this episode, and I love what we find out about his character. I mean, we find out tons of shit about his character in this episode, and it's all just so well done, and just, I love what we found out about his character here. So, basically, the vet offers him some doggy Vicodin, but Mike says he's an aspirin man. The vet gives him a couple on the house. He asks if Mike is passing through or sticking around. He says he knows people and can get him some work, and Mike says he's not looking for that kind of work, but thanks the guy. Now Mike sits with the cops in the police station, and Mike says lawyer. They ignore him. He says lawyer. They tell him he's not under arrest, and he says lawyer, and they ask what lawyer, and he slides Jimmy's car. It's the only scene with Jimmy. Jimmy is barely in this episode. Jimmy is there solely because he needed some sort of a lawyer, so that's why he's there. Other than that, Jimmy is not even the main focus of this episode, and I kind of like that, actually, because, Jimmy is our main character. He has to be in the show. I understand that, but I like this episode took the focus away from him a little bit, because we do need to focus more on Mike and less on Jimmy. So, basically, he introduced himself to the out-of-town cops. They tell him he looks like Matlock, and he says he looks like a young Paul Newman dressed like Matlock, and he goes in and asks Mike what happened, and he offers Mike some coffee. Mike says the coffee is for Jimmy, and Mike says that these cops are from Philadelphia. He says one the young cop puts his notebook in his pocket to spill the coffee on the guy, and Jimmy asks if he called him in to assault a cop, and Mike reminds him that he owes him one for the missing persons thing, and Jimmy says he's going to act like an honest-to-God attorney, which Mike obviously needs, and he's going to appreciate him being there. And he says he's not doing the Juan Valdez bump and dump, and a local cop detective, Escarella, sits in while Jimmy sugars the coffee, and they ask Mike about the Hoffman and Fensky thing, because they're very uncertain about what's actually going on there, and us too. I mean, us as viewers, we're also uncertain as what's going on there, which, as I said, is one of the things I really like about this episode, is the people that he's talking to, they're just as unaware of what actually happened, just like we are unaware, and we're just finding this out for the first time. So, in any other show, this would be like, we know, but they don't. But this show does not do that, and I love that. So, Jimmy says to fill him in, assuming he knows nothing about his client. The Philly cop tells him that Mike worked in the PD there for years, and he had a son, Matt, that was a rookie cop, and he was a good cop, and he responded to shots fired in a rat trap area, and Fensky and Hoffman backed them up. The three were ambushed, but Matt didn't make it out, and Jimmy tells Mike he's sorry to hear about it, and the guy says 3 months ago, Hoffman and Fensky turned up dead in some sort of ambush. Now, we don't exactly know what it was. He says they think that Hoffman and Fensky were into something. They ask Mike if he knows what the two dead cops were into so they can catch who killed Matty, and Mike says he didn't know them much and saw them at McClure's, or Red Dog, the night they died. And he says it was a cop bar, and he says he was drunk. They ask how he's doing, and he says trying hard to stay sober, and this doesn't help. They ask when he came to Albuquerque, and he says it was the next day, but he didn't know they died until he was halfway there. So Mike says he's sorry, they flew in for this, and Jimmy says they're done here. Jimmy grabs the coffee, then heads for the door, slaps the coffee on Mike, who helps him. Mike and Jimmy walk out, get into Jimmy's rust bucket. Jimmy cranks it up, asks if he needs to look through it right in front of him. He asks what's so important that he had to pull at him the stunt, and then Jimmy says he doesn't want to know, but does want to know how Mike knew he'd spill the coffee for him. And Mike's laughing, and Jimmy asks what that means. Jimmy tells him that his Philly friends thinks he killed 2 cops, and Mike just says, yup. That's all he says. He doesn't say if he did or not. He just says yup. So just that word just got me intrigued here. And that's one of the things I love, is that just little things just get you intrigued on this show. And that's one of the things I think they just do very well with this show. So Mike sits flipping through the notebook. He sees a timeline of the night of their deaths, a sketch of the bar, and then timeline of when Mike retired and moved. And he makes a call and says they need to talk, and he goes to Stacey's and asks if she called the Philly PD. Now, the rest of the episode is this conversation. That's the rest of the episode. She says she did, and he asks what she told them. She says she wanted to help catch Matty's killer. He asked what she told him, and then asked if she told him that she thought Matty was dirty. And she says she found money in the lining of an old suitcase. And she says with $5 or $6K from God knows where when they lived paycheck to paycheck. And Mike asks why she didn't come to him, and she says she couldn't. She reminds him that he wouldn't talk to her and was just drinking. And Stacey says that she doesn't care if he was dirty or clean. She says she just wants who killed him dead or rotting in a cell. And Mike says Matty wasn't dirty, and he says that phone call was between he and his son. And he curses her and says to get it through her head. He says his son wasn't dirty, then stomps out, and you can see how pissed he is here. And it's such a great scene because, I mean, he's so pissed at them and everything. And I just love that. Jonathan Banks' acting in that scene was incredible. It's not his best scene in the episode. I will get to his best scene. His best scene comes in a minute. So basically, he goes back in Philly, he heads to a police car outside to a bar, and we basically see what happens here. We see what was going on, and he neatly pops a lock with some string. He looks around, then leans over into the car. Later, he's drinking at the bar, so it's pretty accurate to what he said, that he was at the bar, and he saw the 3 cops there. It's pretty accurate what he said. It's not like he's saying something that's not true. This is what he said to Jimmy, and that's what's going on here. And, the detective, and that's exactly what we're seeing right now. But the thing is, there definitely is more going on than just he was at a bar and 2 cops were killed. There's definitely more than that. So we see what it is here. They greet him and he acts drunk and calls them brothers. He tells them he knows it was them. He smiles at them, then walks off, and basically he insists he's fine, says he sold his car. He says he's headed to Albuquerque. The bartender says they have tarantulas there, and he heads out of the bar into the snowy night, staggering, walks down the street, a car pulls up. It's Hoffman and Fensky. Now, when they got there, I'm like, I don't know what is going to happen here, but this is going to get very interesting. I could tell something big was going to happen. I don't know what was going to be. I just knew that whatever was going to happen, something very big was about to happen. That's all I knew. I didn't know what was going to happen here, and I like that because it just makes you more intense. It just makes you more hyped up for the scene. So they offer him a ride, they stop and insist on giving him a ride, then they put him into the back seat. They tell him they'll get him home in no time. One of the cops searches Mike and takes his gun, saying he doesn't want him to shoot himself in the foot, and he lies passed out in the back when one asks if he's with them. So they comment that he tied one on. They tell him he was taking out his ass when he said he knew it was them. They ask if he's got something to say to them, and Mike says, he says, you killed Matty for nothing. You killed him because you were scared of what he might do. And he says, you got him in that crack house and you staged it. May look like a junkie with a gun. So now we know what happened to Matty, that those cops were responsible for it. But here's what I'm thinking. I think that Matty had drug problems, and Mike is just trying to justify it somehow. He's trying to make it seem like they caused his death, which they really didn't. I mean, if Matty really did do something bad, then it is the cop's job to kill them. If he pulled a gun on them, then it was their job. That's what they had to do. So they decide to make it look like a drunk. Basically, we see, he pulls the gun out he has in the back seat earlier, tucks it into his jacket, then plays drunk again. They tell him to wait there while they work this out. One asks the other what to do. They decide to make it look like a drunk suicide. And Mike holds the gun and says it's smart, what he would have done if he was them. One pulls Mike's gun, but it's not loaded. He shoots both of them. One gets a shot off and hits him in the shoulder. One tries to crawl away, but Mike follows him, puts one more into him, tucks the gun into his pocket, picks up his gun, and walks off. So basically, that is exactly what happened with these cops, and I thought that was a very interesting reveal, and I definitely really enjoyed that. So Mike tells Stacey that everyone, including him, was dirty except for Matty. And he says you go along to get along, and if you turn in your buddy, you were screwing yourself. He says everyone skimmed a little off the top drug deals and things like that. He says Matty never did that, and says Fensky got to Hoffman early, then Hoffman offered to cut Matty in, but he couldn't do it. And he says Matty came to him and wanted to go to IA and do the right thing, and Stacey asked if that's what he did, and Mike says he told him that a cop most fears prison more than getting shot or dying. He says, if you threaten a cop with that, you make him dangerous. He says he talks sense to Matty and says if he even looked like he was going to the IA, it would be a danger. So basically, Matty was an innocent guy who got shot because, he got shot and everything, and Mike really feels he was innocent. He feels that he is the bad one here, and I like that he isn't trying to justify what he did. That's not what Mike is doing here. He's not trying to justify what he did. What he's doing is saying exactly what happened and just stating the facts. Why did this happen? Not, I didn't do anything wrong. He's not doing that. He's simply stating the facts here, and I really like that. So he says he was stubborn and strong and was going to get himself killed. He says he told him that he did it too, like Hoffman. He says that's what she heard that night, him talking Matty down. So he was talking to Matty. And this scene right here was just amazing. He's crying here, and you really feel just that his acting here. Jonathan Banks just killed it in this scene. This was amazing. He says Matty put him up on a pedestal, and he had to show him that he was down the gutter with the rest of them. He says it broke his son, and Mike is crying at this point. He says he went to Hoffman and hesitated, but he didn't look solid. And Mike says he got Matty to take the money, and they killed him 2 days later. Mike says he was the strongest person he ever knew and wouldn't have ever done it to even save himself. And Mike says he was the only one who could get him to debase himself like that. He says he made his son lesser, like him for nothing. He says the bastards killed him anyway, and he feels terrible about it. Stacey goes to sit by Mike, asks who killed Hoffman and Fensky. She asks what happened, and I like what he says to her. He says, look, you know what happened. You just have to ask yourself, can you live with it? Can she accept the fact that he killed 2 cops, and, you know, can she live with that? And that's how the episode ends. So overall, guys, this episode was just amazing. Not really too much happened in this episode. Yes, I understand, not too much happened. A lot happened, a lot more happened in last week's episode. That's why this video is not as long. But there was still a great amount of stuff that happened in this episode. And some amazing, amazing scenes from Mike. We now know everything there is to know about him. And I feel like there definitely is more to know about him. I definitely feel like this is going to go somewhere. I don't know exactly where, but I definitely feel like this has to do with Jimmy's loyalty with Mike's loyalty with Jimmy. I don't know if that's going to change. I don't know if Mike's going to tell Jimmy what actually happened, but I don't know if this case is going to continue, but we'll have to see what happens there because I'm very intrigued by this, definitely. I like the idea of what they're setting up, and I hope that we see more of this because I really like that we focus more on Mike here. Not that I don't love Jimmy's storyline, because I do. I just want to see more of Mike. After what we saw here, I am all for more Mike-centric episodes. He's a great character. Jonathan Banks plays him perfectly. He's doing an amazing job in the show, and I definitely want to see more Mike-centric episodes. However, next week it looks like we're back to the regular storyline, you know, with Chuck and Jimmy, which I am looking forward to because I love last week's episode, but this was by far the best episode of the season. I'll tell you guys why. This episode had the best emotion I've seen from this show so far, and it felt real. Everything about this episode, that conversation just felt real, and I love that about this episode. I think that the way it was constructed was great, and I always love single character focused episodes. I'm always in for that, and this episode did that perfectly. I didn't think we'd get a single character focused episode. I knew this episode was going to focus on Mike. I didn't think it would to this degree, but I love that it did because I really was liking Mike's character and I wanted to know more about him, what really was up with him. And now we know what it is that he thinks that he made his son so bad and things like that, and he needs to live with that. I'm wondering if he's going to reconnect with Stacey. Do you think Jimmy's going to help him reconnect with Stacey? Because I'm very interested in seeing where that's going to go. I really want to see where that's going to go. I'm very interested in this already. I think it's a very interesting concept. I think where they're headed with this idea, I absolutely love it. But let me know what you guys saw this episode. I thought this episode was absolutely amazing. I know this review was not as long as it could have been, but not too much happened in this episode. There really wasn't too much to say. I still absolutely loved it. I thought it was an amazing episode and by far best episode of the season. So I know what you guys saw this episode. I'll see you guys in my next video, which will probably be for Justified, because I think I'm going to do Justified first, because out of everything tonight, that's what I want to watch the most out of everything. So, Pretty Little Liars and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., I'll watch those when I can. I will. I don't know when, though. We'll see what happens there. Even though this was in order, even though I got Bates Motel and Better Call Saul up, even though I got those 2 up, I don't know if I'll be able to get the others up because I don't know if I can go in order, even though I got these 2 in order. So I'll see you guys in my next video. Okay, bye.